You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on April 15th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. So tonight we're beginning a new series of conversations, and the theme we're going to be circling around over these next couple of months is this idea of mystery. Now, I know that word can land in a lot of different ways. Like for some of us, it might sound vague or abstract or maybe even a little impractical because we live in a world that values clarity. We're taught to figure things out and to have answers, to know what we believe and where we stand and what's right and what's wrong. And to be honest, a lot of that is good, right? We need clarity. We need to know when to turn left and when to turn right or go straight when we're going to the grocery store. We need to make sound decisions about our finances. We need to show up in our workplaces with a sense of where we might fit within a team. We vote, we discern what is just and unjust. We choose things, don't we? So I want to begin by saying that this series is not about throwing any of that away. It's not about becoming vague or indecisive or checked out of reality, but it is about asking a deeper question. What happens when clarity becomes the only way we know how to relate to the world? What happens when we apply that to our spirituality or our religious perspective? Because when that happens, something begins to close off. And I think many of us feel that. We feel it in the anxiety that creeps in when we don't have all the answers. We feel it in the way we rehearse the past or try to control the future. We feel it in the rigidity that can show up in how we see ourselves and one another in specific boxes of our own making. And so the invitation of this series is not to abandon clarity, but to rediscover something deeper that has always been there. To shift course as we mature, and to learn to begin circling around mystery. And here's what I mean by that. Mystery is not the absence of knowing. It's the recognition that what we know is always held within something larger, something deeper, and more alive than we can even grasp. Mystery isn't what we fall back on when we don't know, although we can, but it's what we stand on when we finally begin to see. I remember when one of my grad school professors said that mystery doesn't mean that everything is unknowable, but rather that everything is infinitely knowable. Do you see the difference? If it's infinitely knowable, it means that we're always just beginning, that we're always learning. And in many ways, this is something we've already been circling around. We've just been using different language because we just wrapped up talking about this distinction between the false self and the true self. And we've said the false self wants closure. It wants certainty and fixed identity, and it wants to control. But the true self lives with this sense of openness, in presence, in participation, in embracing its own unfolding. So when we begin to talk about mystery, we're not really introducing something new, right? We're, in a sense, naming the spiritual discipline of remaining open. Not, I don't know anything, but I refuse to reduce reality to what I can control. And that's a very different posture. Because mystery interrupts the illusion that life can always be managed and returns us to the only place life is actually happening. In this moment, unfolding in many ways beyond our own grasp. And this connects so deeply with what we've just been exploring together over Lent, this movement of giving up, to waking up, to staying open. Because what we begin to notice is that when we let go, when we release the need to control or define or to secure ourselves, what remains is not chaos, but mystery, wonder, aliveness, presence, and it's a presence that's always unfolding. Now, one of the most important distinctions I want to make tonight, because it's going to guide, I think, a lot of this series, is this. There are two ways of knowing, and we need both. We might call them navigation and orientation. Clarity helps us navigate, right? It helps us get somewhere, make decisions, solve problems, function in the world. But mystery helps us orient. It helps, or it shapes how we are in the world, our posture toward reality. It's looking for beauty and ways to be compassionate, whether we're grounded in fear or openness. So we might say it simply like this: clarity tells us what to do next, while mystery reminds us both who we are and how we are to be within the world. And when we lose that second piece, when we lose our sense of orientation, we begin to drift, don't we? We drift into anxiety about the future. We drift into rehearsing the past. We drift into rigid certainty about ourselves and others. But when we return to mystery, we return to presence, to the unfolding, to relationship, and to the quiet, living depth of this moment. Now, this is where I think the wisdom of Richard Rohr is so helpful, and I know that many of you are familiar with him talking about what he calls the first half of life and the second half of life. But let me just jog our memory briefly here. He says that the first half of life is all about building a container, He uses the image of like a bucket or a jar or a vase. And the container is our identity, it's our structure, it's our clarity. It's about learning how the world works. And again, that's not a problem. That's necessary as far as it goes. Black and white thinking isn't a failure. It's a stage of development. But the trick is, if we never move beyond it, it becomes a limitation in the second half of life. Because the second half of life invites us to start swimming in the deep waters. It incites us into paradox, into surrender, into mystery. Notice that the invitation here isn't to abandon the container, but really to fill it with water, to fill it with depth. So the invitation isn't to choose one over the other. It's to let clarity serve us while allowing mystery to ground us. So there's a part of us that needs to be clear, that needs to decide, act, and move through the world. We need that part of us in those areas we mentioned earlier. But there's another part of us, the deeper, quieter, and often neglected part of us, that knows life is not something we can fully grasp, and craves beauty and mystery and depth and transcendence and interconnectedness. And the invitation is not to choose one over the other, like we said, right? Because sometimes a false sense of clarity can be deceptive, right? I've experienced this in my own life in very real ways, and I hope some of you can relate to these examples, but I've shared before about times when I felt something weird in my body. Perhaps it's like a symptom or a sensation, and my mind immediately begins to build a story about it. It jumps to conclusions, it fills in the blanks. And the wild part is that most of the time it moves toward the worst case scenario. Can anyone relate to this? And before I know it, I'm not just feeling something in my body, I'm living inside a narrative of fear. And what I've had to learn is to come back to mystery, to acknowledge I don't actually know what this thing in my body is. And that doesn't mean I ignore it. It doesn't mean I don't take care of myself. But it means that I don't let my need for certainty create a story that isn't real. And this doesn't just apply to this kind of situation, right? We all live inside the stories we create in our heads about ourselves, about other people, about strangers or figures in the media we don't even know. Here's another example if you think about relationships. How often do we think we know what someone else is thinking, right? What they meant or why they said what they said. And we build this entire narrative around it. And sometimes, if not most of the time, we're wrong, aren't we? But mystery allows us to pause and to say, maybe there's more here than I can see. And that simple shift can open the door to curiosity or to compassion or to connection rather than judgment, cynicism, and separation. And this is where mystery becomes not just an idea, but a way of being. I know that I'm preaching to the choir here a bit. I can think of two-way collective members who have license plates or bumper stickers that uplift this fact, right? Don't believe everything you think and turn to wonder. But notice with me that even beyond spirituality, we can see these ideas reflected in the very structure of reality itself. There's a physicist by the name of Niels Bohr who once said, The opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. Think about that for a second. The opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. That's a remarkable statement, isn't it? Because it tells us that reality is not always reducible to a single answer, that sometimes truth itself is paradoxical. And this is where mystery becomes so important, because mystery isn't about confusion. It's about the capacity to hold multiple truths without collapsing them. Because fear wants either or, mystery allows both and. Certainty flattens reality into one answer, and mystery lets reality remain as rich as it actually is. And this is where we might even begin to touch into what our contemplative tradition calls non-duality. This ability to hold both fear and joy, both suffering and beauty, both individuality and interconnectedness, not resolving the tensions between them, but living within them. Because mystery doesn't dismiss or even resolve the tension of life. It gives us the capacity to live right within this complex world, which I think is what we're all actually longing for. And this is why this matters, because we're living in a time that's pulling us towards certainty, toward rigid answers and clear lines between us and them. And when times are stressful, it's our default mode to go into this kind of thinking. But while clarity has its place again, when it becomes our only way of knowing, it can harden us, it can isolate us, it can close us off from the depth of life. But mystery invites us to stay open, to stay present, and to stay relational. So the goal of this series isn't to become less clear, but to become less afraid of what we cannot control, to learn how to live inside the mystery, because we don't overcome mystery, we encircle it until we learn to live within it. And so as we begin this journey together, I just want to leave us with a simple invitation tonight, and that's to notice. To notice where in your life you're grasping for certainty, where you're trying to close the loop, where you're rehearsing the past or controlling the future. And just gently, when you notice yourself doing this, which we all do, turn to wonder or awe. Turn to find something within you or in your surroundings that inspires you to return to being present. Because when we return to presence, we begin to rediscover a capacity that has always been there within us. And this is what we need in this cultural moment we're living in, because we're surrounded right now by voices that are masquerading as absolutely certain when you can smell the bullshit from a mile away, right? Do you know what I mean? Folks who are certain about who belongs, certain about who or which side is right, certain about the other side being wrong. And that kind of certainty can do real harm. So maybe part of what it means to be contemplative people in this moment is to become people who can hold complexity without collapsing it, who can stay open when everything around us is trying to close, who can meet one another not with easy answers, but with a chosen commitment to one another's depth, you know? I really believe that we're cultivating the capacity to be those kinds of presences in the world here, and I hope that we continue to get to practice that around the table tonight. So I've got 3 contemplative questions for discussion around the table. And the first question is the self question. Where in your life right now are you focused on navigating, figuring things out, making decisions, moving forward? And where might you be invited to slow down and pay attention to how you are being oriented within that navigating? Number 2, the sacred question. When you think about mystery not as confusion, but as a deeper way of being present, what helps you return to that posture of openness or wonder or trust? And lastly, the society question. In what ways do you see a false sense of security being employed to negatively affect the world right now? And or, where do you see examples of people that can hold complexity rather than collapse into either or thinking? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.